Great. So I want you to go on. Get out of here. Do something. This was a quote that my friend's mother would say to us when we were in his home milling about. She would say, go on. Get out of here. Do something. And it just stuck with me forever, but I hadn't thought about it for about 20 years until my good friend Mitch called me up and asked me if I would speak about success. And I said, success. Now, success is an awful word. It implies that if you are not successful, you're unsuccessful. It is very hard to define. It is very personal specific. I don't think I'm a success. I haven't saved a whale. I haven't discovered a star or a molecule. I haven't written a book or a song. I haven't won a gold medal. I haven't developed a video game or an app. I haven't become famous. I'm not a billionaire, and I haven't really changed the world. But I think what you do want is you want a path to follow. And that path is, and I've heard this in a lot of the speeches, it's the passion, it's hungry, it's determined. You want to get a PhD. That's what you want. Now, when I was your age, my parents were not tiger parents, and they really only told me 3 things. They said, my dad said, you need to work for a company that'll give you medical insurance. And I said, okay. And then he said, and you should marry a woman with earning potential. I said, okay. And then my mother said, I want you to go to college. I said, okay, I can do that. Okay. That was my instructions. And now I'm a little bit older than you students, and to give you kind of a perspective, I had a paper route, and that was my life. I didn't know anything outside of my paper route, really. And there was no Facebook, no Twitter, no online games. There were no mobile phones. There was no internet. And this is kind of a weird one, but when we had dinner together, we would actually sit down and have conversations. Crazy. I know you don't know what I'm talking about. But so my generation was all about the job, nothing about the journey. And college, it was. And so I went into the guidance counselor's office. I got a stack of applications to colleges, started flicking through them. One didn't really mean much more than another one. And then I opened one that said, wow, University of Colorado. Look at that picture. There's mountains, and it's green, and there's these. I want to go there. So I applied. I got accepted. And then there was this little voice. Go on. Get out of here. Do something. So I went. 5 years later, I had a political science degree, and I was virtually unemployable. I had a little bit of debt because I had to work it during school, but I really had no job skills. But fortunately, my previous roommate on the 4-year plan was leaving his job in a place called the Caribbean, or the U.S. Virgin Islands. And he said, do you want my job? I have to leave. And I was like, job? Okay. They give you money? Okay. I said, where is that, Caribbean? Now, mind you, I was 20 years old, and I had never eaten seafood. I didn't even eat pepper. So, Caribbean, okay. So I went. There was that voice again. Go on. Get out of here. Do something. So I did something. I went. And paid off, a little more debt, and had some good experience. And I got a little taste of this thing called outside of America. There was actually people outside of America, and they did things, and they traveled interesting places, and they had other stories to tell. It was really exciting. I got a little taste. So I did that for about 6 months, and then I went back home. This is what you do, and you live with your parents. And I'm from Washington, D.C., and I, had this little international flavor. And I said, okay. Now, D.C. is the center for non-paying internships. If you ever want to work for free, you go to Washington, D.C. So I got one in the matchmaker trade delegation of the Department of Commerce, which sounds all fancy, but they just basically help U.S. companies find markets for their, in my case, it was shoes. So I was working in there, and this was cool. We were talking about countries, and I didn't really know their names. And then I said, how can I do something a little more not with my parents living at home? So I leveraged that into an internship in 1991 in Santiago, Chile. They also had unpaid internships there, apparently. Well, actually, they didn't have them. No one had ever asked. I just picked up the phone, called the consulate, and I said, hey, can I come work as an intern? And they said, what's that? So I told them what it was, and the next thing you know, I'm on a plane headed to Santiago, Chile in 1991. This is when Pinochet, who was a dictator, was leaving, and the first democratically elected president, Eduardo Frei, was coming in. So it's kind of for a political science major, it was pretty cool. And it was that voice driving me again. Go on, get out of here, do something. So I went. I met the ambassador the first day, big place, breakfast. Wow, I made it, this is cool. Second day, they told me I was out because I didn't have a security clearance. And I was like, well, what's that? So they were nice enough to park me in the American Chamber of Commerce, and I stayed there for about 6 months, and I was like, I'm really liking this international thing. I like it a lot. So I returned to D.C., and after 2 unpaid internships, I needed what was called money because you need it. And I'm living with my parents again. So I knew a little more than my paper route, but my paper route people, they trusted me. So I went and knocked on their door, and I said, hey, your house is, the paint is falling off. I said, can I paint that for you? They said, yeah, sure. I said, and your driveway needs a little help. I mean, look, it's all crackly and not looking good. Can I fix it? Yeah, you can do that too. And how about your deck? Sure. And all of a sudden, I had a little business. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I figured there's other interns here who are not being paid. And so I hired them. And I had to work with these people from Harvard and Princeton and all these Ivy League schools that were, I think they were very intellectual and very good at school, but they couldn't paint to save their life. So I did that for a while, and I was making really good money. I was like, all right, I'm an entrepreneur, this is happening. But I hated the smell of paint. And you get paint on your hands and paint in your fingernails, and then blacktop emulsion is like one of DuPont's finest carcinogenics in the world. So I said, I'm getting out of here. So I applied to an international graduate program thinking, this is my meal ticket out of here. I'm going to leave this country. I think I have a little bit of passion. I want to go outside of America. So I got a 2-year international MBA that allowed me to live in a few more countries like Japan. I lived in the rainforest in Guatemala. I lived in Mexico. And then I graduated. And then I made my biggest mistake. I was in debt, $100,000 US. And I had an MBA, but I really didn't have any job skills yet again. And so how does one pay back $100,000 US with no job skills? I said, all right, how are we going to do this? Well, I'd studied some finance and some things like this, and I said, I'm going to work in finance. That's where you make money. Finance, money, pay back my debt. Okay, but I still want to leave America somehow. So I went into my finance professor's office after about 900 job rejections, and I said, look, I took this course from you. You need to get me a job. And I think he felt a little threatened, so he slides this business card out in front of me and says, here, call that guy. Call him. So it was an alumni at a place called Bear Stearns, and Bear Stearns was a big financial institution, and fortunately, before me, there was a graduate from my school who was the gift of employees. He rocked it. He was great. Everybody loved him. And when someone else from his school applied to go there, they said, must be the same caliber. Come on in. And the lady who I ended up working for looked at my resume. Virgin Islands, Caribbean, Chile, mowing lawns, painting houses. Like, yeah, this is a lot like my background. I'm like, okay. So I got the job. Anyway, it was very humbling because I think it was the greatest, she was the greatest salesperson ever. She could remember everything, and she told me a very valuable lesson. She said, you always invest in yourself, and you are only as smart as what's in your head. And that always stuck with me, right? Because if you're ever trying to figure out what to do, reinvest in yourself, okay? That will always pay dividends. But I still want to get out of America. I really did. So there was an opportunity for me to sell a stock. I was an institutional stockbroker in a country called China. And I worked for a U.S. company, which meant nobody cared about anything other than America. So I sold a lot of this. The person in Hong Kong who was the office sales manager said, who's that guy? And they asked me on Thursday if I wanted to go to Hong Kong, and on Monday, I was in Hong Kong because there was that voice. Go on, get out of here, do something. And there I was, Monday in Hong Kong. Wow, 1991. that was 1997, October. I think the day I arrived, the market fell into the toilet. And so I wasn't sure I made the right decision, but what are you going to do? So I had, accomplished my dream. I kind of followed my little passion, get out of America. I paid off my debt at this point, and 13 years later, I'd worked for 2 large banks, and I kind of left my job, and I said, what am I going to do with my time now? I have no passion, I have no hunger, and I'm really not determined to do anything. And I think you guys have a lot of passion, a lot of hunger, but you're still not sure what you want to do with your time, right? And you're not sure what that next step is going to be. And so if I had to do it all over again, I would do something like start my own business, because it's actually quite a simple formula. If you can solve a problem, then you can have a business. If you can solve a problem, you just focus on solving that problem. Now, that problem may be an app that makes something easier, better, faster, simpler. That may be an online crowdfunding opportunity like Kiva.org that has provided $715 million to over 1.7 million people who wanted to buy a horse or a cow or a chicken or some way to help their family. There are so many things you can do now because you have something I didn't have, and that's called information. You have the internet. Everything is accessible to you. You can launch a book tomorrow. You can get opinions on any new product you want on your little Twitters and Facebooks. It's all there for you. It's so much going on, it's scary. And that's where you're sitting right now. But you know what? I was going to talk a little bit about failure, and I realized that that's a my generation problem. I'm kind of worried about putting anything on Facebook. You're not. You don't care. You don't care what people think about you. You just slap it up there. Send each other photos all day long. You're not actually afraid to fail. And that is fantastic, because go out there, try, start your business, do something, and if it doesn't work, you now have the tools to learn what you don't know online from MIT for free. Oh, money. But you have kind of a different problem, right? And there's this really smart person, and he's called a futurist, and he can tell you what's going to happen in the future. And his name is Dr. Frey, and he works at the Da Vinci Institute. And he said that 60% of the jobs 10 years from now have not been invented. Okay? When I was going to school, it was doctor, lawyer, banker, blue-collar worker. That was kind of it. We didn't have a lot of options. So here's some of the jobs. Waste data manager, avatar designer, privacy manager, data hostage specialist. So how do you prepare for that? Now, if there's any tiger moms here, cover your ears just for a minute. Cover your ears for 1 second, because you may not need to go to college to work in these industries. You actually may be better off going out and learning some real skills to prepare yourself for what you don't know is coming. Because if you spend the next 4 years of your life in college, you're going to have a great time. You may have a little debt. You may not have any debt. And you're going to come out of school going, what am I going to do? Do I really have any job skills? And sadly, 45 minutes after you leave that class that was kind of interesting at the time, but you really didn't have a peg to hang that knowledge on, that information is gone. And today, 50% of the unemployed people have college degrees. Now, I'm not discouraging you from going to school. By all means, do. But you still need to start your own little business, okay? You can do that at the same time. So I have a colleague in my office, and he's 25 years old, and he's bright, and he knows a lot about finance, and he's got a girlfriend, and he's from Hong Kong, and he's just kind of like struggling with, is this my life? And he said, can I talk to you? I said, sure. What should I do? I said, what do you mean what should you do? I said, what do you want to do? He says, well, all my friends they're getting their MBA, they're getting their CFA, and I said, then when are they going to do that? Well, they're going to find a job and they're going to work in finance. I said, well, finance isn't what it is when I was in it, and I'm not even sure what it was when I was in it. I said, but what do you want to do? So, I want to be a metallurgist. I said, metallurgist. I work with metal. Yes. I said, all right, look, let me just tell you the only thing I understand. I said, I hear you. You're in Hong Kong. If you don't leave Hong Kong now, you're going to get married. You're going to end up going to family dinners every Sunday. You're just going to be here forever. I said, let me give you one piece of advice. Go to Brazil. Go to Africa. Go anywhere else. But just go on. Get out of here. Do something. And we'll see what he does. Thank you.